Best greetings, my friends. Best greetings from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Today, 3rd day of June 2020. And the subject of this stream online video is devoted to the communication with the famous evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is a famous, well-known personality, and actually he is evolutionary biologist. He is English ethologist. He is Professor Emeritus of a new college in Oxford and in many others educational universities. And actually he became very prominent with his book published in 1976, The Selfish Gene, which popularized the gene-centered view of evolution and introduced the special term, interesting terminology, meme. In his book, Intended Phenotype, he also introduced into evolutionary biology the influential conception of phenotypic effect of a gene are not necessarily limited to the organism body, but can stretch far into the environmental conception. He also published other books. He is well known as an outspoken atheist. He is well known for criticism of creationism and intelligent design. His well-known books are Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, and others. And I found very interesting interview with Richard Dawkins, which was published in the journal Science and Public Affairs in the United Kingdom. And I'm very pleased to read it aloud just for white audience, because white audience can just watch me or can just listen to my speech, and also to know more about Richard Dawkins and his ideas, and definitely from his personal view from his interview. So I have a journal with this interview, which was done by journalist Jeremy Cherfas and the journal Science and Public Affairs. So let's go to this interview. I will read questions and answers of a Dr. and Professor Richard Dawkins. So I hope so some questions, some answers will be interesting for you, my audience, because my audience includes speakers not only from Russian-speaking countries, but also from English-speaking countries all around the world. Let's go to the interview with Professor Richard Dawkins. The question: you're best known for your book, The Selfish Gene, but a lot of people got quite upset of the title, saying genes could not possibly be selfish. Well, answer. Well, one person said that. I don't think it is serious matter. A philosopher should know that when I speak of a selfish gene, I do not mean a gene that has motives. I think it is safer to talk about selfish gene than it is to talk about, for example, a selfish elephant. There is a real doubt about how many animals can have motives, including selfish ones. But no sane person could think that DNA molecule has motives. I had thought I was safe, wherefore in using this phrase. The question: so, what do you mean when you say that a gene is selfish? Well, answer. You have to see in the context of the debates that were going in the evolutionary biology. The group selection, species selection, individual selection debates. One way of putting it is to say that at some level we're talking about a selfish entity that works to preserve and propagate itself. It is in an unplanned, unforeseen, automatic way. A Darwin entity takes whatever steps are necessary to preserve itself throughout the time. This is the sense in which a gene is selfish. In that sense, neither groups nor species No individuals are the Darwinian selfish entities. It has to be a selfish replicating entity that is selfish. Hence the phrase, the selfish gene. Question. So, the groups, species and individuals do not have an identity through time. The answer. That's right. They do not make copies of themselves. David Hull and I agree over most things, but he is wrong about this. He thinks that the individual organism is a replicator, but in a very bad one. A goose makes more geese, and in this way, that's a making copies of itself. It is just a bad replicator, since each goose gets only half of genes from each parent. But I say that a goose is not a replicator in any sense whatever. Not even a bad one. Even an identity cloning a sexual organism, such as a stick insect, is not a replicator. Its genome, the set of all genes, is a replicator, but the stick insect itself is not. To say the opposite, a tantamount to committing the Lamarckian heresy. The question. One of the more arresting concepts in the book The Selfish Gene was that of memes, mental constructs, which are to mind and culture, the genes are to anatomy and behavior. We don't hear that much about memes these days. What memes? An unfit meme. The answer. Not at all. There is even a new journal devoted to the study of memes. And there are problems with trying to apply Darwinian ideas to culture. For Darwinism to work, it seems that one has to have something equal to Mendelian genetics, a very high stability of instinct molecules. Genetic mutations are extremely rare. It is the digital system. The genes do not blend or merge in a quantitative way. So if cultural Darwinism is to work, there are certain conditions that have to be met that may not to be plausible. On the other hand, there are things that do not make memes look plausible. The current epidemic of computer viruses set up a new analogy. There are programs written by malicious people who spread themselves around a generic epidemic way. They are in one way or another self-propagating and are obeyed in any computer they get into. The epidemiology of these things looks identical to the epidemiology of measles or whooping cough. They are DNA-like and extremely meme-like. I have toyed with the idea of the community of brains being susceptible to a virus of this kind. What would it feel like if you were the victim of a mental virus? You will find yourself possessed to a mysterious but deep inner conception, which you might describe as a faith. It might even sound like a still small voice. If you ask yourself why you hold this particular faith rather than another of hundreds of available faiths, you would notice that it is a had more to do with epidemiology than with evidence. It is exactly the same faith of your parents. If a virus of this kind has been around for some centuries, it might have evolved to take action for its own survival. It might even drive you to kill people who had an alternative faith. So I think there is a possibility of science of mimetics waiting to be developed. I should, however, say that when I first used the word in the selfish gene, I was not trying to make a point about human culture, but rather an anti-gene point. I was really saying that you can do Darwinism without DNA. Darwinism is much more than just DNA-based theory. It is the only theory to have can be account for increase of organized complexity, which is life anywhere in the universe. The question. Much of your writing is to say advocacy, and the ideas you advocate are often most clearly expressed mathematically. Can your verbal expositions, equivalent and powerful though they are, even have the persuasive power of mathematical model? The answer. John Maynard Smith once wrote that he doesn't understand why I don't use mathematics, since clearly the ideas are so mathematical. I obviously think in words, he wrote, and yet I get it right. There are important truths that you cannot get without mathematics. For example, the outcome of the Fisher theory of sexual selection. You can explain it in words, but you don't know whether it will work until you do the mathematics. I would not wish to be associated with those, and there are many, who are proud of being non-mathematical, but I am gratified to be able to go quite a long way using words, believing that there is a much that is mathematical behind the words. The question. You often use very concrete metaphors when explaining why an animal behaves as it does. For example, the idea that it weighs up the costs and benefits of some course of action and then decides on the basis of this calculation. You justify the approach of saying it doesn't matter what the animal is actually doing. It behaves as it is, weighting costs and benefits. But are you interested in mechanisms? The answer. As if consciously calculating could be said of any computer program which behaved as if it were weighting up costs and benefits. Yet we do not have to think that the computer is conscious. The question of mechanics of animals' rules of thumbs is an interesting and important question. But we can do our Darwinism without bothering with it. It is a matter of neurobiology. The question. You also make a great deal of use computers, both as metaphors and as it aids to your thinking and advocacy. Do you regard organisms as computers? The answer. I do think that organisms and computers are the same kind of things. Neither of them are mystical objects. The laws of physics must be applied in the order to explain both. In another hand, the statement that organisms are computers could be mistaken to mean that organisms work like computers in some more detailed sense. For example, that they are binary digital codes, that they are serial processing devices with huge infallible memories, and so on. No. The question: so here's another as if. The answer: sort of. But I do prefer to say that if you work into the future technology of computers, they may be computers that are a lot more like brains than the present ones. Parallel computers are becoming prominent already. The question: are computers capable of thought? The answer: not yet. I can take no reason in principle why they should not be. I am persuaded by well-known thought experiments such as progressively replacing an entire brain, neuron by neuron, with silicon equivalents. Presumably, there would be no particular moment when the consciousness disappeared. Much arguments seem to me persuasive. I do not think that conscious thought is ruled out of the machines of the future. The question: you began your biological career as an ethologist, studying the natural behavior of animals. Why? The answer: I suppose I was inspired by Professor Nico Tinbergen, who was my tutor. I wanted to work with him, and I did. Question: Nico Tinbergen, one of founding fathers of ethology, must have been an important influence in Oxford. What was it about his approach that attracted you to work with him? The answer: much of it was his personal kindness. I characterize his approach somewhat differently from the way it normally is. He's seen as a great field experimenter, which of course he was, and a great naturalist. But what I most recall from the lectures was the idea I was to later dump the survival machine. He didn't call it that. This is the idea that the organism, including its behavior, is a machine of survival and reproducing. He talked of nervous system as behavioral machinery. I found those images very inspiring. The question: Nico Tinbergen, like other scientists, Konrad Lorenz, or other scientists, Carl von Frisch, was in the title of one of his books a curious naturalist. Do you see yourself as a naturalist? What are your earliest recollections of the natural world? The answer: I am sorry to say that I am not a naturalist. My father is a naturalist, but I was never any good one in learning the names of the birds and flowers. I never collected anything. So my interest in biology was not that of a naturalist. I got into biology more of its philosophical interest. I saw Darwinism as a providing answers to deep problems about existing and purpose. The question: you spent some time at the University of California in Berkeley in the needy days of 1968. What was it like? And did the experience have any effect on your academic development? The answer: I was very involved in the politics of that time. I went on marches. My involvement was, if anything, a distraction from what you have called my academic development. Perhaps it did make me iconoclastic, but that put me in mind of the fact that in the field of Darwinism there is a good living to be made by people pretending to be more iconoclastic than they are. I am anxious not to be associated with that. I think I'm an orthodox neo-Darwinist, although I express it in the unorthodox way, which I hope is illuminating and which may even help Darwinism to have more force. For instance, the idea of extended phenotype. The question: having pursued an analytical approach to the mechanism of animal behavior, always bearing in mind that it is shaped by natural selection, that prompted you to switch course and take such an interest in the explanation of evolution? The answer: that switches came about during the Winter of Power phase in 1973, I think. I couldn't continue with my research. I was using Skinner boxes and other electrical apparatus. When the power went off, I switched to writing. I was expressed by the persuasiveness of a group selection fallacy in the popular view of Darwin. I decided to write a book. I call it my bestseller, which wouldn't be reply to people like Robert Aldrich, who implied that modern Darwinism was group selectionist. I wrote one chapter of a book, The Selfish Gene, and then went back to the research. Then the power came on. But on sabbatical leave in 1975, I returned to the book and worked seriously and fast. This is a good way to write a book. Otherwise, if you spin it out, you are a different person when you finish. The question: you have argued with natural selection as an inevitable consequence of life forms that reproduce, that you would expect it whatever we might find life. Does natural selection, in sense, define life? The answer: define is perhaps too strong, but I would put my shirt on the bet that whatever there is a life, anywhere in the universe, it will be Darwin life. The question: would you believe someone who said X is alive if you didn't think X had evolved? No, the answer. I would suspect that was some trickery. If that were ruled out, I would have to be forced by the facts. Another possibility is that it has made by something that had evolved. The question: are you associated very much with the idea that the natural selection is a slow, radial process in contrast to Stephen Jay Gould's ideas of punctuated equilibria, described by John Turner, another radialist, as a theory of evolution of jerks? Is there really much a profound difference between the these two schools of thought? The answer: I don't think that there is. I believe that Darwinism has always left plenty of room for the idea that evolution goes on different rates and might even stop on the long periods of time. I think that the only sort of punctuationalism that will work is one of which evolution, when it happens, is still gradual, though it might be rapid. During those periods of rapid evolution, it still must be radial, otherwise you had the problem which Darwin encountered of accounting the spontaneous adaptation by luck. Radialistic evolution is the answer to how you can build up to complex adaptations, which are otherwise statistically too complex, too improbable to contemplate. So if there is a punctuationism that is amounts to as rapid, spasmodic radialism, the question: what do you think then when you see critics of the whole idea of national selection latching onto the arcane internal arguments? I think it is a form of opportunism. There are people such as a creationist who desperately want evolution as such whole to be untrue. So when they are seeing internal arguments such as those we have just been discussing, they will seize upon them to suggest that there is something fundamentally wrong with Darwinism. The question: many people bridle in the suggestion that studies of animals can be anything to say about the human's condition. The question: what is the relevance of animal studies to modern humans? The answer: speaking taxonomically, human beings are just one of the 10 million species. We're just a tiny twig on the enormous bush. Our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, are extremely close and extremely recent branched off. It should be a singular anomaly if we could learn nothing from the rest of the bush. Having said that, every species has its unique characteristics. Our own uniqueness are very particular, and to force a naive Darwin interpretation of everything we do in our everyday lives would be an error. Most of us, while writing these books or whatever it is that we do, we are not thereby advancing our Darwinism fitness. The correct way for the Darwinist and Darwinism and Darwinians to interpret the behavior of any animal which is no longer living in the natural environment there is where its genes were selected is to say something like the following: this brain and body were shaped by natural selection of one environment. It is now living in another environment, so you cannot interpret its behavior naively as increasingly its genetic fitness. For example, moths fly into candle flames not from some urge to commit suicide, but because candle flames are not a silent part of the environment, salient part of the environment in which the genes were naturally selected. The world in which we live is the greatest forest of candle flames of one sort or another. We can go back to the moths and say they are probably using candle flames as a light compass. In nature, bright sources of light at night are always an optical infinity and can be so used. As soon as the world contains candles which are not optically infinity, we must rewrite the question. For example,